Well, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Jason Levine, and thank you so much for joining me today on the Friday Masterclass, where today it is all about going back to audio basics. And I mean literally the very basic fundamentals of audio: waveforms, decibels, levels, metering, frequency, all these things that you hear, all the terms that we use. And if you're not really an audio person, you hear this stuff kind of flying around, maybe you don't really know. And a more informed audio engineer is without a doubt a better audio engineer. Even if this is not kind of your thing, it's good to just be aware of just a little bit more of the detail of what these things do, because this can ultimately inform you and help you create better mixes, understand how to also see audio, and we're going to be showcasing a little bit of that today, leveraging Audition, and really give you just a new perspective on working with audio. As many of you know who create for any kind of social context or YouTube or Vimeo or TikTok or anywhere else, these days we can kind of get by with kind of video, right? It doesn't have to be super polished, doesn't have to be super, fancy. But if the audio is bad, you just kind of lose the whole thing. And it's no different in film or TV or anything like that. So this is what we're going to be talking about today, real fundamentals. This was a customer request over the last couple of weeks after doing all of these masterclasses, specifically with our new audience tuning in from No Film School. Hello. Just a lot of people asking about, hey, do you have anything just on fundamentals? Like what are decibels? How do I talk about decibels competently? Or can you explain frequency a little bit more? So that's what we're going to do. We're going back to basics here. Hope you enjoy it. It's good for a reference. And I'm going to pull up a couple things. I had some actual written documents from years ago, some courses that I used to do at Adobe Max, where I'm going to kind of give you some just guideline, baseline ideas around particularly working with frequency. So again, kind of going back to that equalization. We showed some of this a couple weeks ago when we were mixing sound to picture, right? What are the ranges of bassiness or muddiness or mid-ranginess, or if you're trying to add a little vocal presence, or you're trying to minimize vocal sibilance or something like that. I've got a little chart that I'm going to pull up for you there. A good little reference tip that you can always use. And again, these are, they're ranges, they're suggestions, but they're pretty fundamental. So as always, we're coming to you across Adobe Live, Behance, YouTube, Twitter, and we're back on LinkedIn today. So thank you so much for joining. I see we've got Brandy Fraser, Stephanie Avila. How's it going? Chrissy Lang. Oh, looks like something just happened on LinkedIn. All right, maybe I'm not there anymore. Charisse Addison, Matias Vieira, Jose, Shiomi, Rahul, Jenna Perry. Is this live going to be saved? Yes, it is. All right, Reverb Mike, Jacqueline Hyde, Steve Festus Kosaboom. Very nice to see you. Teresa Ann Conlin, Henrik Heigl, Tim, Eugene, Jurg. Great to see you all. And we've got Mike and Stephanie over on my channels as well. And Matthew from North Idaho. Great to see you. Okay, Stephanie V is saying, yes, it takes a second, but it's coming back on the LinkedIns. All right, Rahul from India, Pierre Jad, hello. Chrissy, all right, restarted and all good. Okay. All right, so let me go ahead and switch over to Audition. Oh, and I just realized I hadn't launched Premiere yet. So, okay, we can come back to that in a little bit here. We don't need to do that this second. But we're really just going to start. Oh, and I didn't really reconfigure my UI. That's going to bug me, so let me just do that. So I'm just slightly better looking in the frame there. Okay, so where do we start? Well, I actually decided that the best way to do this is to start with the most basic of things, which is sine waves. And first, to really begin by giving you some definitions. So first and foremost, actually, I'm going to go back to the camera here for a second so we can go through these definitions. 5 basic terms that you need to kind of understand if you're going to be working with audio. And I mean this. You should really know what these things are. If you really don't know, if you can't really sort of identify frequency and what it means, you're just not going to, I mean, sure, you could pull up an equalizer and maybe make something sound better, but you're not really going to know what you're doing. And maybe that's fine. That is fine. But knowing what you're doing is going to just allow you to go that much further. So at the fundamental level here, when we're talking about sound, we're talking about decibels, okay? And decibels are just a unit of measure of the intensity of a sound, right? Comparing it with a given level on a logarithmic scale. Now, as I've talked about previously, This definition, which is still true, in particular, so we're still working in logarithmic scales when we're talking about decibel levels, whether on a mixing console or in the Premiere mixer or the Audition mixer. One slight modification to that, and I'm going to cut back over to Audition here just for a second. You'll notice that when you look at your mixers in Audition or Premiere, all right, I'm going to zoom in here so you can see this. Not too much. That's good. Okay. So here we have a channel. I'm looking at this Rhodes channel right here. Okay. So on the left-hand side, you'll see measured in decibels. That's what that little dB is. Okay. Everybody's kind of seen that before. Lowercase d, uppercase b. If you do uppercase, that's incorrect. Okay. On the left-hand side, this is effectively measuring in that same logarithmic scale analog decibel levels. The difference is that in the digital domain, and what that means is, by the way, so that based on the dynamic range of your previous medium, all right, we're going to get to dynamic range in a second. We all know dynamic range from photography, right? Or video, right? A certain number of stops gives you a certain amount of light that you can use. In this case, we're talking decibel level. Let's use something like vinyl, all right, records. When you're pressing, going to a vinyl 12-inch LP, you had a dynamic range of about 80 decibels, okay, which means that negative minus. Let me start again. 80 decibels of dynamic range. So you have a certain amount of sound, right, that is the quietest, and then you have sound that is the loudest that it can get. And when you're measuring this in the analog domain, while 0 is sort of the average, the median, you can go above 0 decibels in the analog domain. This is kind of what is known as going into the red. And if you see old volume meters, classic sort of VU meters, VU stands for volume units. One of the things, if you wanted to kind of crunch your sound or make it a little bit warmer, or a little bit more, just give it a little more color, is you would go into the red. And this produces a little bit of kind of tape distortion, but in a really positive way, sometimes a little bit of overmodulation. It's hard to explain because we're not working in this domain anymore. But if you look at this meter, this can be a little deceptive because you see 0 is right here, and then it goes all the way up to plus 15. So you're thinking, oh, well, I have 15 decibels and I can go above 0. That doesn't really make any sense. Okay. I'm saying all this, which is to say that along the right side, this is what we call a negative logarithmic scale. This is what the digital domain is working in. This is what we are all working in, all right? So if you're recording anything into your DAW, into your digital audio workstation, anything into your Zoom recorder, anything into your iPhone, we're working digitally. And we're working in a negative logarithmic scale, which means that in the case of digital audio, all right, now, we're not going to get into bit depth and all that stuff. That's a little more advanced. That's not basic. But let's just say standard for, YouTube, Spotify, CDs is 16-bit audio. Okay, so 16-bit digital audio has a dynamic range of 96 decibels. So that means that at the bottom of this scale, minus 96 is the quietest. It's silence, right? And 0 is the loudest. It is absolute. There is no going above 0 in the digital domain. Now, this is really important to understand because as you're recording again on your like a Zoom recorder or a Tascam recorder, you'll notice that you have your level meters, but you'll notice that, and they may show the traditional analog logarithmic scale where you have signal above 0. Okay. By the way, typically when you were referencing things in the analog domain going to digital, it would generally be about minus 18. Right? That's sort of the differential here between 0 digitally and the equivalent of that in the analog domain. Again, forget analog domain. Negative logarithmic scale. That's what you need to keep in mind. So we're always working towards 0. So what does that mean? So that means that when you're capturing sound, you're always going to be looking at things that are like, let's say if you're recording a voiceover. Where do you want those levels to be? Now, we're not going to get into gain staging today, but typically your levels are going to be hopefully somewhere around, say, -9 or -6 or maybe even -12, right? They can be higher, they can be -3, they can be -2, they can be -1, they can be 0, don't recommend that. But if you go above 0, unlike in the analog domain, you're just going to have distortion, and not the good kind, right? It's essentially sonic destruction. So 0 is as loud as you can get. It is the toppermost of the poppermost in the digital domain. You do not want to mix things up to 0. You just don't. Why don't you? Because you always want to leave a little bit of headroom. And the reason for that is that when you ultimately deliver your content to some of the aforementioned destinations, like a Spotify, like Apple Music, like YouTube or Vimeo or TikTok or anywhere else, you're ultimately delivering compressed media. And when you take master uncompressed audio and compress it, let's say you're at -1 decibels, -1 dB. Well, when you compress it, right, you're throwing away data. Those levels can change, and they can go above 0 dB during playback. And when they do that, sometimes you'll incur digital artifacts, which in some cases is unnoticeable. Sometimes it might be a little momentary pop or a click, and other times it can just be a disaster if it's prolonged, if it's for more than just, a millisecond, right? So I'm not smooth today. All this to say, in the digital domain, when we're talking about decibels, we are working in a negative logarithmic scale. Okay, and that brings us to the next part. So when we're trying to add sound in decibels to something, we are dealing with amplitude, which is the maximum extent of a vibration or an oscillation. And you hear me talk about this a lot, right? Increasing the amplitude. What is the overall amplitude of this mix or the balance, right? Amplitude directly relates to the levels in decibels measured on those meters, okay? So you hear me talk a lot about amplitude. We attenuate, we boost, all right? Amplitude, decibels. All right. What is that amplitude? What is the content of that amplitude is made up of sound frequency, okay? Now again, you're going, why is he talking about these stupid basic things? Because I'm going to show you here in a second how we can reference these things differently and different ways to think about working with them and understanding frequency. Now again, this is our little dictionary definition here. The rate at which a vibration occurs that constitutes a wave, we'll show that in a second, measured in cycles per second. Now, you don't typically hear people reference frequency in CPS. However, if you go back 60 years ago, probably even 40 years ago. I mean, when I studied this, I mean, we talked about this in university. They used to talk about, like, we often refer to 60 cycle hum, particularly if you're in the video and audio world. That's the that you sometimes get when you're on set and things. 60 cycle hum. Yeah, that's 60 cycles per second. That's where that reference comes from. On old consoles, you would sometimes see written out, or like old tape machines that could generate tones, a 1 kilohertz cycle tone, or 1,000 cycles per second, which is a 1 kilohertz tone, all right, typically a sine wave. So frequency directly relates to all of those different cycles of that sound, right? There's low frequencies, bassy things, mid frequencies, high frequencies. And there are specific frequency ranges that dictate specific sounds like vocal presence, as we discussed, or boominess, or muddiness. Also, think of every note on an instrument, right? Middle C, A, all of these tones on a piano correspond to a specific frequency, all right? So for instance, when you're tuning a piano or tuning a guitar or just using a standard tuner, a standard tuning frequency is 440 cycles per second, or 440 hertz, which is A. It's the note A, all right? Very commonly used. So we're going to come back to all of this, but one thing that I just want to show you quickly before we move on is that while Audition allows you to obviously work with, and we're going to get back to wave in just a second here, and sine wave tones and all these other things, something that I've shown here before is called our spectral frequency display, all right? Now, we're not going to spend a ton of time on this. Oh, let me go to just something a little bit more little bit more robust here. Actually, no, that one's perfect. So this was a sine wave that I just had pulled up here. Now what I want to show you, hopefully it'll come through on the stream, is along the vertical axis here, we have our frequencies. And you can see from 0, by the way, I can zoom in here. So from 0, there's 50 hertz, 100, 150, 200, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Up and up and up we go. All right, I can zoom back out. You can see as I zoom out, the ranges change. Now, I'm working in 48 kilohertz, which means that our top sampled frequency here is 24 kilohertz up at the top here. And this happens to be a 110 hertz sine wave. So if we zoom in, all right, you can actually see visually, there's our center frequency right there. That is what 110 hertz looks like in the spectral frequency display, right? And we also know that this is a generated tone because it's completely linear, completely flat, completely straight. Now, contrast that to something like a vocal. So this is me singing a vocal, all right? We'll zoom in a little bit more here. Obviously, your voice encapsulates a much larger range of frequencies, right? So down below here, we can see, and again, you see a lot of these wavy lines, right? Well, when they're totally straight, that's just telling you how amazing my pitch is, right? When you're seeing them wiggle like that, now, yes, that is compression and rarefaction, but not in this display. You're actually seeing the modulation of frequency, i.e. vibrato. That's what that looks like, okay? And you can see what frequency that's happening at. We can even isolate a particular frequency. Now, this is in the 500 hertz range over here. I can highlight a couple of the octaves of that as well, the harmonics of that. Let's just hear with this little, this is very short. It's going to be very quiet. You're not really going to be able to hear it. But that's what I'm doing right there. By the way, that extends far higher, as you can see. We're in a very small range, okay? But that's what vibrato looks like. Once you start to identify what sounds look like in this frequency display, this really lets you to understand and see what things look like that, in particular, don't belong there, like plosives, popping Ps, right? Which are those big bursts of air. They will always be confined to this range down here at the bottom. And that allows you then to come in here and say, oh, you know what? Now this would be yellow if it were a plosive. Color is amplitude here. You could say, oh, I see that plosive. Now I want to take that out, but is that going to destroy the sound of that voice or the vocal? Well, all of those frequencies are below approximately 60 hertz. Again, we're going to talk about range in just a little bit. So no, in the context of this, you can see I'm not actually even singing. The notes that I'm singing there aren't reflected in that range at all. And I could simply hit delete and take out that little plosive and you'd never hear it gone. You'd never hear that it was ever there, is what I'm saying. All right? All of this to say that you can visually start to identify frequency once you understand the basis of what it all means, all right? Pretty cool. If you've never, I mean, I know I've shown this a lot, so you've seen it. You're probably like, BFD. But it is pretty cool. Also, again, like, it starts to get really cool when you kind of look at, you know, again, singing, what that looks like, right? Straight notes, little wobbly in the mid-range there, and then clear vibrato right here. All right. Pretty cool. Okay. That's frequency. And then the two last ones here. Let me go back to my cam view so we can just pull this up. So we talked about waves and waveforms, all right? Sound waves. Now, this is a pretty long definition. Let me read this for you first, and then we'll actually kind of talk about this in a more intelligible way. Okay. A pattern of disturbance, this is very scientific, caused by the movement of energy traveling through a medium as it propagates away from the source, right? Pressure vibrations of compression and rarefaction, right? So as sound waves travel through the air, right, they're producing high and low pressure. Those high pressure areas are the compressions, and the low pressure areas are the rarefactions. And a really good way to illustrate that is to come back to our waveform view here. Let me go into our screen. All right. This is a sine wave. Now, you're looking at this, and even if you're an audio pro, because I'm completely zoomed out and this is 7 seconds, you're thinking, oh God, what if I didn't tell you that was a sine wave, you'd think that was a really horribly mastered piece of audio, completely brick-walled. The reason it just looks like a solid rectangle is that we're zoomed in. Sorry, that we're zoomed out. Oh my God, what's happening to my brain? We're zoomed out. If I zoom in on this, you're going to see that this is going to start to look like what you expect a sine wave to look like. And if you've ever looked at an oscilloscope, right, this is what a sine wave looks like. What does it sound like? Okay, so that's 110 hertz, as mentioned. And again, you can see those areas of pressure changing over time, right? A good way to illustrate like sound waves is if you've ever stood in front of a big pair of speakers, right? And you can feel the sound. Well, that's what you're feeling, right? And it feels sort of like that. Now, I've also talked about this on previous streams. You know, you can use sound to actually not only control mood, but control, in some cases, control how you actually feel in terms of, it can really throw someone's equilibrium off and make them kind of sick. Subsonic sound frequencies. So lower frequencies have longer waves. The higher the frequency, the shorter the distance between those wave peaks and troughs there. So really high frequency waveforms are very tight and close together. The lower the frequency, the longer the wave, the longer the pattern of that wave, because the longer it takes to get out, to be expanded, to travel through air. In this case, if you were to do something like a 20 or 30 hertz waveform, which is generally not necessarily audible, but it can be felt and or perceived, some people get really sick. I'm one of those, like, I remember we did a course when I was in university, and we were in this controlled studio, and one of the professors, when we walk in, it feels creepily silent. I mean, it's all sound treated anyway, so it feels kind of creepily silent. And we're sitting in there, and they have these massive subwoofers. So speakers that are really meant to be able to reproduce super ultra low frequency. Not all speakers can, by the way, right? This is why people put new, different types of very large subwoofers in their cars and trucks and homes, because regular speakers can't necessarily reproduce super low frequency sound. So we're sitting in this theater, and all of a sudden, some people, you can see people are getting kind of sweaty, myself included. A couple of people start looking a bit green. They were generating 20 hertz sound waves from these subwoofers that were underneath the seats. Now, you don't really hear it. You kind of sort of feel it, but it's more this weird perception. And people started to get kind of sick. You can do that. Similarly, you always see in these, sci-fi films, someone's emitting this super high frequency. Now, sometimes if it's inaudible, obviously you wouldn't hear it. But there are upper range frequencies above 15, 16 kilohertz when at high amplitudes can be very, very painful, right? So you can actually control mood, don't get any ideas, with high or low amplitude sound waves. Again, with lower frequency, the amplitude doesn't have to be that high, but you have to have a system of transmission that can actually handle the reproduction of that low frequency sound. And most necessarily can't unless you have a really good, highly rated subwoofer. Even most subwoofers can't necessarily reproduce much below, 35 hertz. That's being generous. Good subwoofers, yes, but some of the more commercial ones, the range is generally about 40, which is still good. But if you're trying to do sort of scientific stuff, you need a little more. Okay. All right. One last thing, and I mentioned this before, and this is one of the most important because this is something which, again, as we work digitally, you need to be intimately aware of, which is dynamic range. Now, again, here our textbook definition here, ratio the largest to the smallest intensity of sound that can be reliably reproduced by a given sound system measured in decibels, okay? So, with each medium, CDs, vinyl, tape, we had different levels of dynamic range, okay? Cassette being one of the worst, analog tape being pretty good, vinyl being pretty good. Now, early CDs I talked about, these were 16-bit. Now, what determines dynamic range in the digital domain? The bit depth that you're recording into. Now, by default, all 2022 systems, without question, can record in 16-bit definition, which is going to give you 96 decibels of dynamic range, and that's fine. However, for music production, audio production, sound production for film, all of your external recorders, whether it's Atomos or something like Zoom I mentioned, they will all record at a minimum at 24-bit. And 24-bit is going to afford you approximately 144 decibels of dynamic range, which means that you can capture things very quietly, right? And you can capture things with just an enormous amount of range without introducing noise. And this was really the big deal and the big shift when things moved to digital, right? Because in all of the analog domains, tape, cylinder, vinyl, etc., you were always fighting against this noise floor. So the dynamic range is sort of directly related to how quiet can the sound be where we can still hear that sound and it's not completely overtaken by just the natural artifacts of the limitations of the medium at the time. In the digital domain, if you're in an isolated environment, a clean, quiet environment, using clean, good equipment on good, clean electricity, you can record signals technically at, let's say -100. And if you amplify them 90 decibels, there won't be any noise as a result of being captured through the digital domain. Now, you will likely have dither noise and other types of noise because, stepping out of basics here for a minute, when you're recording in 16-bit, 20-bit, 24-bit, it behooves you to record signals. You can record things super quiet, but there is, at a certain point, a diminishing return. The lower the amplitude, the lower the bit depth you're taking advantage of, so you may have a slightly artifacted sound when amplifying in excess. Okay, are we in a college course now? Getting a little deep here. You're not going to really have to worry about that all that much. All this to say that when you record digitally, you have an enormous amount of dynamic range. So when you're trying to capture things like room tone or very subtle ASMR, right? You don't have to record things super hot. Again, you never want to have your peaks going to 0. 1, because you don't have to, but 2, because you have an enormous amount of dynamic range to work with, all right? So keep that in mind. The dynamic range is super relevant and super important to how we sort of produce our content moving forward. Okay, so let's dive a little bit deeper here. I gotta take a quick... Okay, quick little sip. All right, so let's talk very quickly about metering before we kind of move on. Now, and I'm going to open Premiere as well here. So one of the things that you can do, which is really nice, is you can modify how you meter sound and signal inside Audition and Premiere. And in particular, when you're in the mixer here, it's particularly relevant when you're, say, ingesting or recording something, a signal, because you want to be able to see what that input level is, okay? When you're playing back or mixing, you may want to reference a different level. And the reason for that is, again, as we're looking at those faders, those meters here. Premiere is launching. All right. Right now, I am displaying on the digital side a 24 decibel dynamic range. The reason I'm doing that is because I was mixing here, and I'm just really trying to see sort of the top end of where all the signals are falling. Everything was recorded properly. All the levels are fine. So I don't need to see all the level down to, in this case, minus 140 or negative infinity, all right? When you're mastering, you're generally working in a different range. You can even see my master level meter down here. I'm only displaying a 24 decibel range. If you right-click, control-click on the level meters, both in the mixer and in your master here, you can change the viewable decibel range, all right? I think the standard is, the standard is 72. I generally use about a 96 decibel range when I'm recording something. And part of the reason for that, and you'll notice, by the way, that it changes the scale immediately, right? So now we're seeing minus 96. Same here on the level meters on our faders, all right? Same thing here. The reason for that is, and if I were to go into, let me just do something like this channel here. I'm just going to set an input real quickly. I don't want this to feed back. I'm just going to set a random input. There's no signal going in there. Okay. If I wanted to record, all right. Oh, sorry, that's the output. Darn it. What am I doing? If I wanted to record a signal here on this Rhodes channel, go into record mode. What you're seeing here is this is showing me, remember we just talked about you don't have to worry about noise in the digital domain? Okay, so this is recording into my Focusrite Claret at 24-bit resolution, and you can see that with nothing, the noise floor is below minus 90 decibels. So it's really, it's at the theoretical bottom. You can't hear that. There's nothing there. Now, if this were tape, right? One, that would be about almost 20 decibels higher, but there'd be that slight tape hiss here. Digital, this is totally clean. Again, clean environment, nothing going on here. This is an input from a synthesizer there. So again, the output of the synth is clean in the analog domain. Super, super low. Now, if I were to have this at a 24 decibel range, I don't see anything, okay? In fact, I'm only going to see signal once it gets beyond minus 24. So for input, that's not really telling me anything. Similarly, if I go to 72, now that's great. Like I'd look at this and go, oh my God, my input is so quiet. By the way, side note, anybody who worked on PCs 20 plus years ago and remember Sound Blaster cards, right? 72 decibel ranges would be fine because the Sound Blaster had a noise floor at like minus 60. It was, I mean, they were good for the time. They're impressive, kind of early digital, but they were noisy, right? So like all the benefits of, hey, we're digital, no tape hiss. Yeah, but you had like this weird hissy electrical noise on Sound Blaster cards too. Always around minus 60, minus 64, okay? So again, I don't even really know how quiet is my sound device. Go to 96, now I can see it, okay? All right. So there are reasons why you adjust those ranges. Now, you could leave it at 96. There's no reason not to. But remember, we're in a logarithmic scale here. So let me just let me isolate something here. I'm just going to solo these drums, all right? I'll pull them down. Okay. So if I'm in 96 decibels, right, and I'm really trying to get a good idea, I mean, this is a very simple drum part. Bad example. Gosh darn it. All right. Sort of the moving average range here. I'm seeing a lot. I'm seeing a lot of levels, right? If I switch to something like 48, you can see how now I'm really only seeing those transient attacks and seeing where those peaks lie. And if I go to 24, now I just have a tighter view of where those peaks are falling, all right? And the peaks on these drums are somewhere around minus 11, minus 10, okay? Again, I'm playing a real simple, just like 4 to the floor, kick, snare, hat all together, right? So this is just to point out that you have a lot of options here and variability when showcasing dynamic range. Now, another important element of metering is choosing between dynamic and static peaks. So this is particularly useful if you have problem audio. If you've got dialogue that, again, before you compress or alter it in any way, you've just got some areas that are really hot, and maybe you have most of it is really quiet. So if you use something like static peaks, okay, it's going to hold these peak ranges for you, all right? If you use dynamic peaks, you can see it moves and resets, and when I stop, they go away, right? Now you might think, well, why would you want dynamic? Well, to kind of see how it's changing over time before compression or after compression, right? Different reasons to do that. And then there's one more element to this. Now this is getting, again, a little bit deeper, but this helps to understand average loudness, because we're going to come back to this in a second. Show valleys. And what this is doing is sort of showing you a representative average over time of the level, okay? And how that's moving over time. That's this inside the waveform here, okay? So again, metering is super important because it's going to inform you where you are, how much dynamic range you have to play with, right? If my whole signal is hitting 0 while it's playing back, what does that tell me? I've got nowhere to go. I can't make it any louder. I can attenuate, I can make it quieter, but I can't really do much more there, all right? So you got to be really mindful of all of that as you're mixing sound. And don't forget that as you add sound on top of other sounds, right? Remember I talked about it when we were mixing video, I like to set all my faders to like -3 or -6 to give myself headroom. Yeah, because as you start to add more voices, more music, more sound design, the overall amplitude on your master, right, the final fader here, or sometimes known as the 2-mix or stereo bus fader, increases. All right, now here's a little tip again. Now, you may hear audio engineers or people who are mixing talk about 6 dB and sort of the 6 dB rule. All right, and this is that a change of +6 dB SPL, which stands for sound pressure level, basically represents a doubling of amplitude. All right, a doubling of amplitude, 6 dB. You think, how can that be? Well, again, logarithmic scale. The reality is that yes, it's a doubling of the amplitude, but when we're talking about loudness and how we perceive the overall volume, it actually is about 10 decibels. This is not exact, but it's about 10. But the rule is, if you're going to increase something by 6 decibels on your fader, you've basically made it twice as loud, okay? So you can see how if you've got a bunch of things and you start increasing everything by 3, by 6, etc., stuff can get really, really loud, really out of control really quickly. So this is why it's a good idea, whether you're mixing music, whether you're mixing audio for video, to start with those faders down to give yourself a little bit more headroom, right? Remember, digitally, we've got a lot of dynamic range to play with. And you want to fill it all up. You do. I actually mean that. When you get to your mastered version, part of the mastering engineer's job is to fill all that additional headroom, all right? For good or bad or otherwise. I can't say I love it. It's just how it is. But when you're in the mix phase, you got to give yourself room, because one big sound effect can throw everything off, right? And then you can attenuate that one sound effect. Sure, you can compress it. There's things you can do. But if you're not really intimately aware of how to do it, you're going to spend a lot of time moving around faders trying to make that happen. Okay, hold on. I just want to open up my Premiere project real quickly here. All right, it's coming right up. Let's go back to this. And just to point out real quickly while we're in the audio mixer here, again, the fader looks just like it did in Audition. So here you can see, I told you, my general, I usually work in 96 decibel range. Okay. So same kind of thing here. Right click and you can adjust, and it's all the same It's all the same settings that you just saw in Audition. All right. By the way, that reset indicators is if you have static peaks, you can manually reset them with that. Okay. But it's all the same here. All right. Also, show color gradient. Not important to necessarily point that out, but that's just when you have the it's got to play this.
Oh, but Dwayne, I don't even have any of the money. Amy just she split and took it all.
Well, I talked to Amy. She came to see me.
And you can see that everything above -6 is in the red. Again, that's in direct correlation to, remember I was saying, in the analog domain, now you wouldn't necessarily push all signals to +12, but it's that concept that in analog, when you went about, again, depending upon the source signal, 8 dB above where you'd want to be, above 0, you were in the red. That was actually a good thing. So that's why it's kind of simulating that look there, I guess. I guess that's why they did that. Again, you're still okay in that range digitally, but you do not want to go to 0. You don't want to hit 0. If you show the color gradients, though.
You see, she's what they call professional, and you're what they call can't win for losing.
All right. I just like the look of that better. There's no, use one or the other. It's better for you. They work the same. It's just whatever you prefer. Okay. All right. Okay. Lexi Rom, that's very good to hear. You were trying to, struggling to understand how to make your voice sound better. And Lexi Rom, if you go to my channel, or you can find it on the Creative Cloud channel, I have an Audio 101 series. I also have a whole series of things about podcasting, choosing your microphone for your voice, and improving your voice. A lot of videos there, many of them live streams, some chapterized, some not, but there's tons of stuff on there to kind of show you how to better improve all of that. And yes, Cynthia, you can access all of this later. All right. All right. Oh, I see. Stephanie's talking about binaural beats in meditation. Oh, yes. Actually, I have a stream about that as well from years ago. Damien, yes, I do work for Adobe. Florent, bonjour from Paris. Jörg from Dresden, great to see you. Masome, okay. Jeff from Northern California. Great to see you too. All right, Yusuf from Nigeria. Okay. I remember the toaster. Oh yeah, me too. Okay, all right. Nerding out a little bit more on them fundamentals, y'all. Okay, so I was just talking about loudness. And we started off talking about decibels, right? And I mentioned VU, volume units, the old school meters. By the way, for anybody who doesn't know, I'm doing this. This means nothing. If you don't know what I'm talking about. Let me open up a nice classic compressor here. Okay. It'll have a single meter here, even though it's a stereo compressor. But this is the old school VU meter. Okay, that's what it looked like. And okay, so this is what we used to use back in the day before we used, these. By the way, when I first got into the studio industry, really, I mean, if you were mixing something professionally, even into the early 90s, yes, we already had LED-based colored digital meters that were still measuring in the analog domain, right? They were just LEDs as opposed to what you just saw there, instead of volume unit. Well, they were volume unit meters, but not that old format. But especially if you worked in a studio that had like old school console, then old school, like SSL or Neve, you lived and died by those VUs because there was. And by the way, what you're really looking at, you're not looking at peaks there. You're looking at the average. You want that pin to be somewhere slightly right of center. All right. If it goes all the way to the right, that's a transient peak. And if it's staying there, your audio is just hosed. It's overmodulated. It's destroyed. Again, we're not going to talk about analog. I can just get on so many darn tangents. Okay, back to digital. Loudness, decibels, these things. So we have a panel in Audition called Amplitude Statistics. Now I've done so many different live streams on this topic. But this is yet another way for you to really understand all the things that we just talked about, all those basic fundamentals, levels, amplitude, bit depth, all these things that you need to know, dynamic range, about your audio, about what it is that you're doing, okay? And inside this panel, when you scan a file, all right, it happens pretty quickly, obviously based on length, it's going to tell you everything you need to know. So let's look at what these statistics are here. So first is the peak amplitude. Now, again, notice minus 0.4. So it's 0.4 of a dB below 0 is where the peak amplitude is. And it's the same for left and right because I had some kind of a brick wall limiter on the output of this file. All right. So that is the absolute peak. That is the loudest momentary signal in this file. And if you click on these little buttons here, it'll shuttle you to that exact, it's probably that transient that we can see right there. It's probably that one right there. It'll take you to that exact spot where that loudest peak amplitude was. Now, even just a few years ago, and it's relevant, of course, to any kind of digital production in terms of medium. So when you go to Blu-ray, when you go to CDs, you need to understand peak. Again, if you have peaks above 0, you will have what is known as possibly clipped samples. A processing plant will bounce. They will deny reproduction of your disc if you have clipped samples. Because again, as I told you, when you go above 0 dB, also known as 0 dBFS, full scale, bad stuff happens. So you always want to make sure that your peak amplitude is below 0 and that your possibly clipped samples are 0, okay? You'll notice right below that we have this thing called true peak. Okay, now I'm going to go on a little tangent here. It's going to be a little slightly higher level than basics, but it's just something you can be aware of. Again, you can look at older streams of mine or Google this to find out more. In today's audio delivery world, while peak amplitude is important and it must maintain below that 0 decibel level that we discussed, we're actually not so concerned about overall peaks anymore. For instance, I can tell you that years ago, I used to do some stuff for the BBC, and when you would normalize your final audio, they wanted all peaks to be at -6, I think it was, all right? There was, of course, this idea of sort of average level as well, but very concerned about the peak levels. I'm not saying that they don't still do that. But a lot of broadcast organizations were, again, at that time, very concerned with peak level, not average loudness. But as anyone knows today who watches anything, listens to anything, today it's all about loudness, perceived loudness. And it's about maximizing the domain so that we just have sort of consistent loudness, because advertisers, along with producers of this content, realize that if you can keep something consistently loud, where we perceive that it never changes, there's no dip in that amplitude. When there's no dip in amplitude, no dip in that sound, it keeps people engaged. It just does. It grabs them. It also may annoy them, right? And that's why, a couple years ago, 10 more, when there wasn't really a standard for loudness, that's why you'd come out of like a football game and they'd play a commercial and it would be like literally twice as loud, 10 decibels louder, fall off your chair, go back to the game, super quiet. The peak amplitudes of those broadcasts were likely the same, but the perceived loudness and the average loudness of said things were different. And that's because today, when you deliver, particularly for, again, this is for like film, video, they're going to ask you to measure your audio, not in dBFS, decibels relative to full scale. They're going to ask you to deliver your audio in a different measurement known as LUFS. And this is loudness units relative to full scale. Now remember, VU stood for volume units. Every time I hear loudness units, it always makes me think of Guardians of the Galaxy. Loudness units have been around longer than Guardians of the Galaxy, but for whatever reason, that movie and paying in units always sticks with me, just makes me laugh. Loudness units. And today we are working off of these different sort of broadcast loudness standards, okay? It's the average loudness, the perceived loudness. Now, -17 is actually quite loud. And for a standard broadcast loudness, that's actually technically too hot. Broadcast loudness in the US is minus 23, minus 24. I can't remember US versus EBU. So at minus 17, we're approximately 6 or 7 decibels out of range. This file, this is a music mix, would actually be bounced. They wouldn't broadcast this. It's too loud. Now they have other systems that can limit and do other things anyway. They can control that, but just to be aware of this. So when you're mixing music in particular and talking about different loudness measurements, we're talking about different scales. Anand, you can ask a question, but we've got a few more minutes, so I'll try and get to it, but please do, all right? So just be aware of that. We're not going to cover all these things in depth today, but I want you to be aware if someone says, okay, you know, what's the average loudness here? If you tell them, oh, well, it's -1, they're going to go, well, first of all, virtually impossible to get something -1 LUFS unless it's just completely audibly a mess. I've seen -3. I mean, I've never, I mean, you could. It just wouldn't sound good. It would be so compressed. It wouldn't sound good at all. You wouldn't deliver that to somebody. All right. So now you know. So peak amplitude references dBFS. True peak, notice it's dBTP because this is the true peak amplitude relative to its loudness. Okay? So dBTP goes hand in hand with LUFS. Even if you don't remember what those things mean, if you can recommunicate to somebody that, they're gonna be like, oh, this person knows what they're talking about. If you say dBFS and LUFS, they're gonna think, you don't really know what you're talking about. All right. Maximum minimum sample value. 2 values that have no value whatsoever. I don't know why that's still in there. I don't really know why that's ever been in there. No one ever measures anything in sample value. There's no modern reason outside of perhaps some scientific reason for displaying that, but we've had it in there forever. That's why it's there. If someone ever asks you, what's the maximum sample value of that? Stop working for them. Unless it's NASA or something. Okay, all right. No one who produces video or audio of any kind for entertainment purposes ever will reference those values. Ever. Period. All right? Possibly clip samples, already talked about that. Okay. And then we have 4 values here that, again, reference kind of an older standard of loudness. RMS stands for root mean squared. What these are measuring are average loudness over time. And you have, as you can see, like a total average loudness. So again, this is in the dBFS world, this is sort of akin to LUFS-ish. It's not, RMS is not the same, but I'm trying to relate it some way. But then you have maximum average loudness, okay? So again, there's an average, there's like a total loudness, and then at its maximum loud, and then you have the minimum loudness, which is really kind of the quietest, which is -73. And then you have an average of the average, which is all very confusing. Of these, the maximum RMS amplitude is actually pretty indicative because this one is going to help you. Essentially, once you start increasing loudness units, this maximum it's not going to change very much. If you're already at maximum RMS, -8, and we're at maximum, we're at -17 LUFS, I'm going to show you. When I show you my final mastered version of this song, the maximum RMS changed about 3 or 4 dB, whereas the maximum loudness in LUFS changed about 10 decibels, okay? So this one is still fairly valid. I mean, they're all valid, but this one you can actually still use to sort of gauge, again, that kind of maximum. This is pre-mastered, this file. So what we're trying to do in the master is make everything kind of in that maximum range. Some people hate that. I kind of hate that, but that's what we're doing when we master audio. All right, just looking at our time here. Okay. All right. Jeff Goodland, yes, if Adobe Audition is the only tool that you have to work on audio, it'll work. It's not the best tool for the job. It depends what you're doing. I mean, sure, they all do different things. If you're trying to do analysis, if you're trying to do dithering, if you're trying to do sample rate conversion, I challenge anyone to show me anything that's better. Show me something that's better. Let me see something sonically that's better. Now, if we're talking about other things for post-production, effects, mixing things, yes, there are, because it's limited. It doesn't have some of the things that those do. But actual editing, analysis, mastering analysis, mastering with effects too, but just these kinds of details, show me something better. I've not seen anything. And that's not me being biased. I told you, I still haven't moved off it, by the way. I'm likely moving to Logic for multi-tracking, but I still haven't moved off it. Is it the best for multi-tracking? No, it's not. Okay, DC offset. Complicated. You're not going to likely run into this unless you're working with older digital media. This is something that you can repair using the normalize function. I don't want to get into this because it's kind of irrelevant for 98% of all of you. If you're dealing with old DATs, you might run into DC offset issues. And emphasis, not likely to happen. Measured bit depth. Okay, now again, we talked about bit depth before, directly related to dynamic range. Recorded via my device at 24-bit, but Audition, much like Premiere, works natively at 32-bit. All right, that's what we're seeing there. And then you have your legacy perceived loudness. I realize we are now at 26 minutes after the hour. We are out of time. Let me go into the final version. You can see where the master is -9 LUFS, and that maximum RMS is -3.6, so about a 3 dB change as mentioned. Unfortunately, friends, that's all the time we have. Looks like I'm gonna get cut off. Have a great rest of your morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Happy July 4th to all of you in the US. Bye-bye.